One movie, that's all it took to destroy careers worth millions. How does a global superstar go from untouchable to completely unwanted overnight? These weren't small failures. They were cinematic disasters so massive, they didn't just lose money. They erased reputations. And behind each collapse is a story Hollywood doesn't like to talk about. Because sometimes the biggest threat to a star isn't scandal. It's one role that goes horribly wrong. Jaden Smith, After Earth, 2013. By the time After Earth arrived, Jaden Smith wasn't just a young actor. He was a carefully constructed future star, backed by the legacy of his father, Will Smith, and positioned as the face of a new generation. The film was meant to be a defining moment. Instead, it became something far more damaging. The movie's sterile tone, the emotional flatness, and overwhelming criticism turned what should have been a launchpad into a public unraveling. Audiences didn't just reject the film, they questioned the entire idea of Jaden as a leading man. The fallout was immediate but quiet. There were no dramatic headlines declaring an end, just a slow, noticeable absence. The big studio offers stopped. The momentum vanished. In Hollywood, silence is often louder than failure, and for Jaden, that silence stretched. He didn't disappear completely, but he stepped away from the very spotlight he had been pushed toward. What makes this case unsettling is how quickly the narrative flipped. One moment, he was being positioned as inevitable. The next, he became a cautionary example of overexposure and expectation. After Earth didn't end his career, but it ended something arguably more important: belief. And in Hollywood, once that belief is gone, rebuilding it can take far longer than anyone expects. Alicia Silverstone, Batman and Robin, 1997. Before Batman and Robin, Alicia Silverstone represented something rare: effortless stardom. After Clueless, she wasn't just popular, she was culturally dominant, with a presence that felt both natural and unstoppable. Hollywood had already begun shaping her into its next long-term leading lady, but when she stepped into the role of Batgirl, everything changed, and not gradually, but all at once. The film itself became infamous, but what followed was more personal. Critics didn't just attack the movie, they targeted Silverstone directly. The media amplified every flaw, every performance choice, even her appearance. What should have been a stepping stone turned into a public dissection. And in an industry that thrives on perception, that kind of scrutiny can be suffocating. The shift in her career wasn't loud, it was strategic. Silverstone began stepping away from the blockbuster machine that had just rejected her. Smaller roles, theater work, and selective appearances replaced the fast track to superstardom. To outsiders, it looked like a quiet retreat. But underneath, it reflected something deeper: a loss of trust in the system that had built her up so quickly, only to tear her down just as fast. Batman and Robin didn't erase her talent. It erased the version of her Hollywood had planned to sell. Taylor Kitsch, John Carter, 2012. There are failures, and then there are industry-defining collapses. John Carter was the latter. With a massive budget and years of anticipation, the film wasn't just a gamble, it was a declaration. At the center of it stood Taylor Kitsch, positioned as Hollywood's next great action star. Everything about the rollout suggested inevitability. This wasn't supposed to be a risk. It was supposed to be the beginning of a franchise era. But when the film arrived, something went wrong. Audiences didn't connect. The marketing failed to translate its scale into excitement. And almost instantly, the narrative shifted from expectation to blame. In Hollywood, when a massive project collapses, responsibility rarely spreads evenly. It concentrates. And in this case, it landed heavily on Kitsch. What makes this moment particularly brutal is what followed. Battleship, released soon after, reinforced the same outcome. So two massive failures, back to back. The industry doesn't forget patterns like that. The idea of Kitsch as a reliable box office lead disappeared almost overnight. He didn't vanish, but the version of his career that had been promised did. Leading roles became smaller, more grounded, more cautious. The scale shrank. The risk tolerance vanished. John Carter didn't just fail, it rewrote the trajectory of a career before it ever had the chance to fully begin. John Travolta, Battlefield Earth, 2000. By the time Battlefield Earth was released, John Travolta had already staged one of Hollywood's most notable comebacks, rebuilding his career in the late 1990s after years of decline. The film was not just another acting job, but a personal passion project closely tied to material he strongly supported. When that personal investment would later shape how the failure was interpreted within the industry and by audiences alike. Upon release, the reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative, with critics rejecting its execution, tone, and narrative structure. Audiences followed with similar distance, turning what was expected to be a major sci-fi event into a cultural punchline. The disappointment carried additional weight because Travolta was no longer an uncertain figure, but a proven box office presence. That contrast between expectation and outcome made the failure feel significantly larger than a typical commercial disappointment. In the aftermath, his career did not stop, but the nature of his opportunities began to shift in noticeable ways. Fewer major studio tentpoles were offered, and more mid-budget or genre-specific projects filled his schedule instead. His reputation remained intact, but the sense of automatic confidence from studios was clearly reduced. Battlefield Earth ultimately did not end his legacy or erase his past achievements. However, it marked the end of a specific phase of his career where his name alone could guarantee large-scale commercial trust. After that point, every new project required renewed proof of viability rather than assumed success. The certainty that had defined his comeback quietly disappeared, replaced by a more cautious industry perspective. Mike Myers, The Love Guru, 2008. At his peak, Mike Myers was one of comedy's most reliable forces, shaping an entire era of mainstream humor. From Austin Powers to animated hits, one of his films consistently turned into global successes driven by a distinct comedic identity. Audiences trusted his style, and studios viewed him as a dependable creator capable of carrying large commercial projects. The Love Guru arrived during a period when that trust was still present, but beginning to feel more fragile. Upon release, the film was met with widespread rejection from critics and a notably negative audience response. Its humor, tone, and execution were heavily criticized, turning what was intended as a major comedy event into a disappointment. For a performer whose brand depended heavily on likability, the backlash carried more than just box office consequences. It began to challenge the perception of the persona behind the characters, not just the project itself. Following its release, Myers did not immediately transition into another major leading role. Instead, he stepped back from the spotlight, allowing years to pass without a significant return at the same scale. In Hollywood, absence often reshapes narrative, and the longer it continues, the harder reintegration becomes. The industry that once centered around his comedic voice began to move in different directions. The Love Guru did not erase his past success, but it disrupted the momentum that sustained his dominance. It marked a turning point where audience trust weakened, and future projects carried far more uncertainty. Once that connection fractures, even highly recognizable stars can find themselves gradually fading from the center of attention. Halle Berry, Catwoman, 2004. Winning an Academy Award is supposed to secure a legacy. For Halle Berry, it should have marked the beginning of an untouchable era where every role reinforced prestige, power, and longevity. Instead, Catwoman arrived at exactly the wrong moment, when expectations were at their peak and scrutiny had become unavoidable. It wasn't just another studio release, it was a high-pressure attempt to turn a celebrated actress into a franchise-driven superhero icon. The film's reception in 2004 was immediate and unforgiving. Critics didn't simply reject the narrative or the visual style. They questioned the entire creative direction behind placing an Oscar-winning performer into a role so widely dismissed. The contrast was striking, from Academy recognition to near-universal criticism in a single project. The backlash became louder than the film itself, dominating the conversation around Berry's career at the time. However, what makes this case more complex is what followed afterward. Halle Berry did not disappear from Hollywood. She continued working steadily, taking on a variety of roles across genres, proving her versatility and resilience. Yet despite her continued presence, something had shifted in how the industry perceived her trajectory. The consistent flow of prestige-driven leading roles became less predictable, and her position at the absolute center of A-list casting began to fluctuate. Catwoman did not end her career. It fractured its momentum. It introduced uncertainty into a path that had once seemed stable and guaranteed. And in Hollywood, uncertainty carries its own weight. Once the image of invincibility is broken, every future project is evaluated more cautiously, in every casting decision more heavily scrutinized. The result is not disappearance but recalibration. And for Halle Berry, Catwoman became the moment that transformed certainty into unpredictability, permanently altering the rhythm of her career. Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez. Gigli, 2003. Some failures stay contained within the screen. Gigli did not. Released in 2003, it spilled far beyond cinema and into the center of celebrity culture itself, merging film reception, media obsession, and public fascination into a single uncontrollable narrative. At the time, Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez were already one of the most visible couples in the world, with their relationship dominating headlines long before the movie's premiere. That level of attention turned the film into something larger than a typical release. It became an event shaped by expectation as much as content. When Gigli finally arrived, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Critics rejected it harshly, and audiences largely stayed away. But the most lasting impact was not the box office performance. It was the shift in perception surrounding both stars. They were no longer viewed solely as actors working within Hollywood's system. Instead, they became symbols of overexposure, media saturation, and high-profile miscalculation. The film blurred the line between performance and persona in a way that intensified public scrutiny. Hollywood reacts strongly to perception shifts, and Gigli triggered exactly that. Affleck and Lopez found themselves increasingly framed through a tabloid lens, a notch where personal life and professional credibility became inseparable. The industry adapted quickly, and the types of opportunities available to both began to change. Projects became more selective, and the once straightforward trajectory of leading roles became more complicated and less predictable. What followed was not disappearance, but recalibration. Both eventually rebuilt their careers through strategic role choices, time away from constant media exposure, and gradual reinvention of their public images. Gigli did not end their careers. It redefined how they were perceived. And in Hollywood, perception is often more powerful than performance itself. Eddie Murphy. The Adventures of Pluto Nash, 2002. Before The Adventures of Pluto Nash, Eddie Murphy occupied a rare position in Hollywood, one built on consistency, versatility, and box office dominance. For years, he had been one of the few performers capable of drawing audiences across genres, from comedy to family films to action-driven roles. His name carried automatic commercial expectation, a level of reliability that few stars ever achieve, and even fewer maintain. Released in 2002, Pluto Nash disrupted that pattern completely. The film did not merely underperform, it collapsed under the weight of its massive budget and weak audience response. What made the failure so significant was not just the financial loss, but the absence of audience connection. For the first time in years, Murphy's presence was no longer enough to guarantee interest or turnout. That shift signaled a deeper change in industry perception. The aftermath was gradual rather than abrupt, but unmistakable. My leading roles became less frequent, and the scale of projects offered to him began to shrink. The era in which Eddie Murphy could reliably anchor a major studio release came to an end, replaced by a more cautious and selective approach to casting him in high-budget productions. This moment redefined his career trajectory. From that point forward, each new project carried greater scrutiny, with expectations no longer built on certainty, but on recovery. The perception of invincibility, once central to his stardom, was no longer present. The Adventures of Pluto Nash did not erase Eddie Murphy's legacy, but it marked the end of his uninterrupted dominance. And in Hollywood, the loss of perceived certainty often changes a career more than failure itself ever could. Geena Davis, Cutthroat Island, 1995. There are films that fail, and then there are films that take careers down with them. Cutthroat Island belongs firmly in the second category. Designed as a large-scale pirate epic, it was built on ambition, scale, and the belief that it could revive a genre. At its center stood Geena Davis, already an established and respected leading actress whose presence should have anchored the entire production. Instead, it became the opposite, a project where expectations collapsed under their own weight. When the film was released in 1995, the response was immediate and devastating. It didn't simply underperform, it imploded financially, becoming one of the most notorious box office failures of its time. The impact wasn't contained to a single studio. It rippled across Hollywood, reinforcing a growing fear of high-budget risks and uncertain female-led action vehicles. For Davis, the consequences were swift but quiet. There was no public declaration of downfall, no dramatic industry statement. Instead, the opportunities simply changed. The consistent flow of high-profile leading roles began to thin out. Projects that once would have been natural fits stopped appearing. The trajectory she had built, steady, visible, and A-list, was suddenly disrupted in a way that felt irreversible. What makes Cutthroat Island particularly defining is its clarity as a turning point. There is Hollywood before it and Hollywood after it. Few careers are marked by such a visible divide. It didn't erase Davis from the industry, but it did remove her from its highest tier, where she had once been firmly placed. Oh, in an industry driven by confidence as much as talent, that loss of positioning is everything. And once a star is no longer seen as a guaranteed draw, rebuilding that trust becomes a far more difficult battle than the original rise. Greta Garbo, Two-Faced Woman, 1941. At the peak of classic Hollywood, few names carried the weight of Greta Garbo. She wasn't just a star, she was an icon constructed from mystery, elegance, and absolute control over public perception. Her image was so carefully maintained that even her rare appearances felt monumental. That is what makes her final film, Two-Faced Woman, so historically striking. Released in 1941, the film was intended as a light romantic comedy, but it arrived into a cultural climate that reacted sharply against its tone and themes. One criticism came not only from reviewers, but from powerful moral and industry voices that shaped public reception at the time. For Garbo, whose entire career depended on a carefully protected aura, the backlash struck at something deeper than box office performance. It challenged the stability of her identity as a screen legend. What followed defied the usual Hollywood pattern. There was no slow decline, no gradual reduction in roles, and no attempt at reinvention within the studio system. Instead, there was an abrupt and total withdrawal. At just 36 years old and still at the height of global recognition, Garbo made the decision to step away from acting entirely. There was no official farewell campaign, no final performance designed as closure, and no return in later years. She simply left the industry and never came back to it. And that silence became part of her mythology, transforming her from a living star into an enduring cultural mystery. Unlike every other figure on this list, Garbo's story does not include recovery or reinvention. Two-Faced Woman did not merely damage her career, it ended it completely. And in doing so, it created one of Hollywood's most haunting questions. Why a figure at her absolute peak chose disappearance over continuation?